The Irish Congress of Trade Unions are describing the bill as useless. Let's speak to John O'Connell, who's the General Secretary of the FSU, that's the Financial Services Union. Good morning to you, John, and thanks indeed for joining us. The Taoiseach sounded pretty reasonable there in how he outlined it, but there's something amiss, it appears.
Yeah, so the initial legislation that was published, we feel, is very employer weighted. And what we mean by that is that despite what the Taoiseach said in that clip that you had, that currently as the legislation stands, the employer can have 13 various very broad reasons for refusing your request to work remotely. And in addition to that, and again, despite what the Taoiseach said, you can only appeal on technical grounds, such as the decision from the employer came to you late. You can't appeal on the substantive grounds. And what was happening yesterday was the Oireachtas committee was I suppose, taking representations from employers and trade unions onto the outline legislation that is published. And that's where we in the Congress of Trade Unions and our union and other unions have worked together to highlight these areas. So this isn't something new. This is something that is in at least 12 European countries, with 6 others proposing to bring in similar legislation. And in the UK and New Zealand, it's been in law for over 8 years and has worked perfectly and doesn't require 13 reasons or anything like it in terms of that. So very weighted favourably to employers. And other than having an actual right to request, doesn't really pan out in terms of what the reality is for people. So I represent people in the finance industry, and the vast majority of them have and will continue for the rest of their working lives, lots of them, to work from home. And so what we're saying is the legislation needs to be strengthened. It needs to be balanced in a way that looks after the business, and we certainly recognise that, but also must have a sense of balance in terms of the reasons on which I can be declined.
Well, let's take the most obvious of all. You can't do the job from home. You have to be here to do the job, and that applies in some circumstances and doesn't apply in other circumstances. If one of your members was told that, undoubtedly they'd be able to respond and say, look, all I need is good Wi-Fi and a laptop and be at the end of the phone and be able to communicate and whatever else, so you could contest it. If it was a barman, on the other hand, of course they can't do the job and serve customers somewhere else from home. But surely the Taoiseach was saying there that in the case of your members, if you were told that you couldn't work from home, you'd be able to contest it and that would stand up and that you would win that case.
And the Taoiseach is on the record saying that the law can be strengthened, but as it currently is written, you can only appeal on a technical ground. Right. And so the barman is one where it's an obvious, where he or her or she has to be in the premises in order to work. And then there's clearer ones, like I said, in my sector, thousands upon thousands of people working from home now and will continue into the future, right? And then there's the middle ground of where there needs to be a debate. So we don't see big problems arising out of this right to request. We think most employers and employees, common sense will apply, and it will go. It's that middle group of people where there's a debate, and if you have a researcher in your program, can they work from home as effectively as they work in the studio beside you, or is it that they're required? There's a debate to be had there, and it could be a blend. That some days it's totally appropriate they're in, and
come in for a couple of hours one day, and that sort of thing, and that's where the law falls down, is it?
Yeah, so that's where the law falls down. It allows a very, very broad, sweeping 13 reasons for employers on which they can refuse your request, and then you can't do anything about that. So even if you are the researcher in the program or the bank worker, you can't do anything about that unless the employer come back to you outside the timelines in the legislation. Whereas what we're saying is, for people who have genuine reasons as to why remote working would work for them, they should have an avenue of getting somebody to independently look at that and say, I think that's fair and reasonable. I think a blend would work for that employee. trial it and so forth. Remember, a quarter of the workforce worked from home during the first pandemic. 25% of the workforce. So there can be no argument for 25% of the workforce. Then there's another high portion of the workforce that is physical work and requires a presence. And nobody is suggesting that people like barmen and hairdressers and so forth can work remotely. Nobody is suggesting that. But there's that middle group of people where they should be given the opportunity to demonstrate. Perhaps they've already demonstrated and the employer is just taking an ideological point of view to say, I want everyone back in the office full time, and that's it.
Yeah, I think employers would argue with that point as well, and would say that there were some problems, and that whilst it may have worked well most of the time, it wasn't ideal a lot of the time for when that quarter of the workforce were working from home during lockdown.
Yeah, I think it does sometimes break down in a task basis, where the certain tasks are absolutely ideal for working from home. And there's other aspects of a role that maybe isn't. So it might take a bit of working through with the employer. But for that to happen, there has to be a good debate. You know, we encourage people to join trade unions so you have a voice and you have people come forward and can have that debate, skilled negotiators on your behalf. And the vast majority of employers are reasonable and will adopt a reasonable approach to this. Remember the upsides of it: improved work-life balance, an increase in female participation in the workforce that is documented and attributed to remote working, reduction in stress for people, and a greater sense of community, local spending by people in their locations, and the great development which the government, to acknowledge, are pushing out in terms of the development of these rural hubs. So
people will tell you as well there's downsides to it as well, of course, the isolation, not having a proper office and work and health and safety work practices being thrown out the window and that sort of thing, leading to depression and lack of interaction with other people, lack of brainstorming, all that sort of thing. But employers might like it on the other hand. I mean, this is a two-way street, because there could be a saving for employers in terms of office space and all that goes with that, light, heat, insurance, and so on. And I suppose you should be asking the question as well, what if people don't want to work from home? Should they be permitted to, or should the employer be obligated to provide them with office space?
And I think this debate will go on for quite a while in terms of till we settle into that nobody has come up with the silver bullet that says this is exactly how it should work. But there is an overwhelming demand from people for it because they see all the upsides. And yes, you're right to point out that there's challenges in it as well, and that's why I think most employers and employees favour a blend. There's a small percentage of the people who would never want to go back into the office, so totally satisfied with working remotely full time. And then there's another small percentage of the people who would like to be in the office full time, and they see that from their point of view. So it's an evolving situation in that respect. But from the point of view of a very simple piece of legislation, which we believe is overly complicated and overly weighted to the employers, that's where our focus is at the moment, in terms of asking government to look at it again and look at the flaws that are there that would make it very difficult to work the legislation. And those two areas in particular, the broad sweeping refusal mechanism and then the right of appeal. And if those issues were addressed, I think we're on our way to a better piece of legislation that's employer and employee friendly.
Okay. John, we leave it there for the moment. As you say, it's a debate that will run for some time to come. And thank you indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. John O'Connell is the General Secretary of the Financial Services Union, the FSU.